The official history of World War I is a story for children. We are told that a tragic series of alliances, accidentally triggered by the assassination of an archduke, dragged the world into a war that nobody wanted. This is a lie. It is the version that deliberately ignores the cold, hard calculus of imperial economics. If you want to know why millions were sacrificed in the trenches, and why the map of the Middle East is a patchwork of straight lines, you must ignore the assassin's bullets. Instead, look at a world map from the year 1900, and you will find the one project that filled the British Empire with more dread than any battleship. It was not a weapon, it was a railway. This is the story of the Berlin to Baghdad line, an iron road designed to connect the industrial heart of Europe to the oil fields of Persia, completely bypassing Britain's maritime chokehold on the world. It is the story of an Ottoman Empire fighting to escape the debt slavery imposed by London and Paris, only to spring a geopolitical trap that was engineered for its total destruction. To comprehend this inevitable tragedy, one must first see the world at the turn of the 20th century. The British Empire was the absolute master of the planet. Its global dominion rested upon two pillars of power. The first was its Royal Navy, which owned every major shipping route across every ocean. The second was the Suez Canal in Egypt. The canal was the jugular vein of the entire empire, the one indispensable shortcut to India, the jewel in the imperial crown. As long as Britain held Suez, Britain decided who could trade with the East. A German industrialist or a Russian merchant who wanted to ship their goods to Asia had no choice but to pass through a British gate. You either abided by Britain's rules, or you were locked out of the global economy. But in Europe's center, a rival power was emerging. Germany, unified in 1871, was transforming into an industrial titan. German manufacturing was eclipsing British production. German engineering was the envy of the planet. But Germany had a fatal flaw. It had no global empire. It possessed no vast colonies to supply it with raw materials at virtually no cost. Worst of all, it had no navy that could even dream of challenging British dominance. Germany was a giant locked in a cage, surrounded by its enemies and cut off from the world's markets by the British fleet. To the southeast of this giant was the Ottoman Empire. For hundreds of years, the Ottomans were a global force, but by the late 19th century, they had become the sick man of Europe. The empire was rotting from the inside out. It was losing territory. Its military was antiquated. But its deepest sickness was debt. The entire Ottoman state was drowning in loans from British and French banks. In 1881, the empire declared bankruptcy. To repay its foreign creditors, it was forced to give up control of its own finances to an organization known as the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was a board of European bankers who were now empowered to collect taxes directly from the Sultan's subjects. When a Turkish farmer made a sale, the revenue did not flow to his own government. It flowed into a bank vault in London or Paris. The Sultan at the time, Abdul Hamid II, was in a desperate position. He knew his empire was being systemically looted by foreign capital. He had to find a way to modernize and defend his nation without going to the very same people who were actively robbing him blind. He needed a modern infrastructure. He needed a railroad to move his armies from Constantinople. Model the desert frontiers in a matter of days, not months. Yet he knew that involving the British or French would mean letting them entrench their own colonial power. It was here that the goals of Germany and the Ottoman Empire converged in a flawless strategic alignment. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II recognized a play that could permanently shift the global architecture of power. If Germany could finance a rail line from Berlin to Constantinople, and then push that line all the way to Baghdad and the Persian Gulf, it would surgically remove the British Empire from the equation. Consider the pure logistics of this system. A train carrying German industrial goods could depart Berlin, cut through Vienna and the Balkans, cross into Turkey, and proceed to the Indian Ocean without ever coming within range of a British warship. This was the blueprint for a colossal overland commercial corridor that the Royal Navy could not interdict. It would fuse Germany's industrial engine to the vast resource wealth of the Middle East. For the Sultan, the railway was a lifeline. For Germany, it was an ascent to global dominance. For Britain, it was an existential threat. The project launched with German capital and German engineers. The behemoth financial entity, Deutsche Bank, spearheaded the operation. The engineering itself was a modern marvel. Teams had to dynamite tunnels through the Taurus Mountains and lay track, across blistering desert landscapes. As the railway crept eastward, a calculated panic began to ripple through London. British strategists saw the map for what it was, a dagger, aimed directly at the jugular of their empire. A completed railway meant German battalions could menace the Suez Canal. It meant German manufacturers could inundate Indian markets with low-cost products. But there was another element, a prize far more critical than commerce: oil. At this exact moment in history, oil was starting to supplant coal as the lifeblood of naval power. The British Admiralty had proven that oil delivered a hotter, more efficient burn. It gave their ships greater speed and a longer operational radius. Admiral Fisher, the Chief of the Royal Navy, declared with absolutism that converting the fleet to oil was a matter of national survival. The problem was, Britain possessed no native oil reserves. They were dependent on supply lines from Persia and the United States. Meanwhile, geologists were confirming that the territory the Baghdad Railway was set to bisect the land of Mesopotamia. What we now know as Iraq was floating on a sea of petroleum. By design, the Germans had written into the deal the mineral rights for 20 kilometers on both sides of the track. The inescapable conclusion was that a finished railway would give Germany control over the very spigot that would fuel all future conflicts. They would own the oil the British Navy required to exist. The British establishment made a simple calculation: this railway must be prevented from reaching the sea at all costs. They deployed every tool in their considerable arsenal to sabotage it. The first weapon was diplomacy. London coerced the Sheikh of Kuwait, a minor state positioned at the railway's proposed terminus, into a clandestine pact with Britain. The Sheikh swore an oath to never lease territory to any foreign power without prior British consent. This was a masterstroke, a strategic checkmate that terminated the railway in the middle of the desert, ensuring it led absolutely nowhere. The next weapon was the press. British newspapers launched a concerted propaganda offensive against the Ottomans, branding them as savages and painting their German partners as supporters of despotism. They reframed the entire project, not as an artery of commerce, but as an instrument of autocratic control. The final weapon was finance, wielded by the City of London. As the undisputed financial nexus of the globe, it issued a decree forbidding any British capital from funding the venture. Their strategy was to financially starve the railroad. But the Germans persisted with construction. By 1914, the tracks had penetrated the mountains of southern Turkey. The entire system was on the verge of completion. The menace was materializing. It is through this lens that the eruption of World War I must be understood. The conflicts between the great powers were never merely about nationalistic fervor or European border squabbles. They were a battle for who would dictate the world's economic destiny. The Triple Entente, an alliance binding Britain, France, and Russia, was explicitly created to cage Germany and halt its expansionist ambitions. Russia was terrified. The railway would empower the Ottomans, an empire they were determined to dismantle. France dreaded German economic supremacy, while Britain trembled for its hold on India and the Suez. When the war ignited, the British military's initial gaze was not fixed on Berlin. It was locked on the Middle East. The immense tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was that it had attempted to leverage the rivalry between European giants to ensure its own survival. But instead, it was ultimately pulverized between them. The Ottomans entered the war aligned with Germany, betting that a German triumph would erase their colossal debts to Britain and France. They dreamed the railway would become a conduit for German weaponry and provisions, enabling them to reclaim lost territories in Egypt and the Caucasus. But they had fatally underestimated the ruthless resolve of the British Empire. The British were not fighting simply to vanquish an enemy army. They were fighting to seize a resource. The moment war was declared, a British expeditionary force was dispatched to Basra in what is now southern Iraq. Its public mission was to secure the oil refinery at Abadan. but its true objective was a northward march. They were charting a course directly along the path of the still incomplete railway. Their purpose was to secure the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before German influence could reach them. The war in the Middle East was a brutal affair. While soldiers in Europe perished in mud-filled trenches, soldiers in Mesopotamia succumbed to heat stroke and rampant disease. The British endured staggering humiliations, such as the siege of Kut, where an entire British army was shamefully forced to surrender to the Ottomans. Yet, Britain commanded virtually limitless resources, while the Ottomans were operating on fumes. The very railway intended to be their salvation was not, yet whole. Critical gaps existed in the tracks winding through the mountains. Materiel from Germany had to be unloaded from trains, hauled by truck or camel across the mountain passes, and then painstakingly reloaded. This logistical choke point systematically starved the Ottoman war machine. Had the railway been completed just 5 years earlier, the outcome of the war could have been profoundly different. This failure to rapidly deploy troops and materiel gave the British the opening they needed to recover, push forward, and ultimately seize Baghdad and Jerusalem. As the conflict ground on, officials from the British and French governments convened in secret to determine the destiny of the Ottoman territories. They did not even bother waiting for the war to conclude. In 1916, two diplomats, Mark Sykes and Francois Picot, sat before a map with a pencil. They carved lines across the Middle East with no regard for tribal affiliations, religious divisions, or the actual geography of the land. But if you examine the Sykes-Picot agreement with a critical eye, you discover that the lines are not random. They align almost perfectly with the planned route of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of major oil deposits. Britain laid claim to southern Iraq and the strategic port of Haifa in Palestine. France was allocated Syria and Lebanon. They were dismembering the empire's corpse to guarantee that no single rival power could ever again challenge their dominance, model dominance once more. The railway, conceived to unify the region, was reforged into the very blade that dismembered it. The betrayal was absolute. The Arabs were dangled a promise of independence for rising up against the Ottomans. E. Lawrence, who would become Lawrence of Arabia, orchestrated these uprisings, detonating the same railway lines that were the Ottoman lifeline. But when the conflict ceased, the Arabs received no freedom. They received the yokes of British and French colonial rule. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled. The Sultan was ousted. The Caliphate itself was abolished. But the debt, that was not forgiven. It was merely re-engineered, to be paid by the new nations carved from the empire's corpse. The British Empire had won. They had crushed the German threat. They had locked down the route to India. And most crucially, they had taken possession of the oil that would power the 20th century. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was hacked into pieces. Its disconnected segments now lay within Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It never again operated as the single, unified artery of trade. It was designed to be the dream of a silk. Road made of steel was over. The shattering of the Ottoman Empire and the failure of the Baghdad Railway created a power vacuum in the Middle East that we are still contending with today. But the narrative did not close in 1918. In truth, the ghost of that railway haunted the territory for the rest of the 20th century, and it has returned with a vengeance in the 21st. After the First World War, the British and French were masters of the Middle East, but they faced a dilemma. They had seized the territory and its oil, but they still had to move that oil to Europe. The Baghdad Railway, once the object of so much paranoia, was finally in their control, but it was useless. The very borders they had drawn now served as new barricades. A train journey from Baghdad to Europe would now require crossing 3 distinct customs borders. It would mean contending with 3 different currencies and 3 different colonial bureaucracies. The economic integrity of the region was obliterated. This was by design. The colonial powers wanted a divided Middle East, one that was feeble and dependent, not a unified force that could one day challenge their supremacy. In the years that followed, the British concentrated on building pipelines, not railways. Pipelines were simpler to dominate. They carried no passengers and no dangerous ideas. They carried only oil. The Iraq Petroleum Company was created, a consortium of British, French, and American oil behemoths. They constructed a pipeline from the Kirkuk oil fields in Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean. This pipeline executed the exact same strategic logic as the old railway scheme. Only this time, the profits flowed 100% to the West. The peoples of the Middle East watched as their own wealth was pumped from their lands and exported, while their own development was left to stagnate. The vision of modernization the Ottoman sultans had pursued was replaced by a harsh, new reality of pure extraction. But the strategic imperative of the Baghdad Railway never really vanished. The concept of a land bridge connecting Europe and Asia is simply too fundamental to disregard. During the Second World War, the railway became a strategic flashpoint all over again. Nazi Germany once more looked to the east. Hitler coveted access to the oil of Iraq and the Caucasus. German agents were deployed to Iraq to foment rebellion against the British. They vowed to finish what the Kaiser had begun. The British, in turn, were forced to invade Iraq again to secure the oil fields and the transport corridors. It was history repeating itself, almost verbatim. For word, the location of the battles changed slightly, but the prize remained the same. Control the corridor. Control the world. After the Second World War, the British Empire collapsed under the weight of its own debts. The United States stepped in to fill the void. The Americans inherited the British obsession with controlling the Middle East. But they used different tools. Instead of direct colonial rule, they used coups and alliances. But they were just as terrified of a rival power dominating the Eurasian landmass. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the new bogeyman. The US feared that Soviet tanks could pour through the same mountain passes that the Baghdad Railway traversed. Turkey became a key NATO ally, not because of its democracy, but because it sat on the most valuable real estate in the world, the choke point between East and West. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, the parallels between the era of the Baghdad Railway and our current moment are terrifying. Today we have a new rising industrial power that is challenging the dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new British Empire, and the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm, the Chinese leadership realizes that they are vulnerable at sea. The US Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In the event of a war, the US could blockade China and starve its economy of energy. So, China is building massive infrastructure projects across the Eurasian continent. High-speed rail lines, pipelines, and highways that connect China to Europe and the Middle East overland. Look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative. It looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a much larger scale. It seeks to bypass the choke, points controlled by the American Navy. It seeks to unite the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East into a single trading bloc that excludes the United States. And just like the British in the 1900s, the Americans are panicking. We see the same headlines in the newspapers. They call the Chinese projects debt traps. They accuse China of supporting dictators. They try to block Chinese companies from buying ports and building 5G networks. The language has barely changed in 100 years. The strategic anxiety is identical. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us that when a declining empire feels threatened by an infrastructure project that could undermine its hegemony, it will lash out. It will use financial warfare, propaganda, and eventually military force to stop the connection from being made. The Middle East is once again the chessboard where this game is being played. The wars in Iraq and Syria, the tensions in Iran, the instability in Turkey. All of these conflicts happen along the exact same fault lines where the rails were laid a century ago. It is not a coincidence. it is geography. We can look at the tragedy of the Ottoman Empire as a warning. The Ottomans thought they could play the Europeans off against each other. They thought they could take German money to build their country while maintaining their independence. But when you invite a superpower to build your critical infrastructure, you are not just buying steel and concrete. You are importing their geopolitical enemies. You are making your land a target. The train, the project that promised prosperity, delivered exactly what it was designed to: systemic ruin. The armies that followed were not an unforeseen consequence. They were the collection agency. That exact same system is now being deployed against all developing nations. Their hunger for development is the vulnerability the system exploits. They need the infrastructure. One creditor class offers to build it with fast debt. Another creditor class warns them away, offering their own version of the same debt trap. It is the illusion of choice. This is not a struggle they are caught in. It is a carefully constructed economic prison. The Baghdad Railway proves the system's core principle: infrastructure is never neutral. A road is never simply a road. It is a mechanism for extraction, a pipeline for wealth transfer. The small elite who control this system will burn the world to the ground before they cede control of the flow of capital. As you observe the chaos manufactured in the Middle East, you are told it is about religion or ancient hatreds. You are sold the narrative of a clash of civilizations. But this is a deliberate diversion. The proof is buried just beneath the sand, the rusted iron of a railway that was never meant to be completed by its original builders. You find the evidence of a financial mechanism that worked perfectly. This is the proof that the borders of the modern world were not drawn to create nations. They were drawn to bankrupt one creditor and enrich another. The world we inhabit, the wars we are forced to fund. And the prices we are forced to pay were all mathematically determined by the outcome of that one project. The system that Train represented is now global, totalizing, and inescapable. Subscribe to see the blueprint. When the inevitable collapse arrives, the history books will be written by the creditors. You will want to be among the few who understood the design. Empires do not collapse by accident. They are collapsed by design. If you recognize this inescapable pattern operating somewhere in the world today, you already know the mathematically certain outcome. If you think this analysis is wrong, prove the math is wrong. If you know it is right, explain the mechanism. The outcome is already decided. I will be monitoring the analysis in the comments. If you want to watch the controlled demolition of the current system, subscribe. The truth is not hidden. It is simply ignored.